I'm Alex Scarrow, author of the TimeRiders series. And let me just tell you a bit about what the series is. Yeah, it's time travel, but it's also a little bit more than that. It's about a group of teenagers who've been recruited from the very last moments of their lives to work for an agency whose one role is this: to stop time travel from happening. Because, as I'm sure you're aware with time travel, the smallest change in the past can lead to a completely different present. And that's what the Time Riders are there to make sure doesn't happen.
All right, yeah. Yeah. Okay, so if I.
But you know your coffee was in shop.
Oh, just
If you're happy with that,
I'm
that's
happy
fine.
with that,
Yeah,
yeah.
fine.
Yeah, looks fine.
Don't drink coffee, kids.
Okay, so do you want me to ask you?
Yeah, if you ask the
We'll cut it
questions,
out,
then
cut it out.
I'll...
Okay. What were some of your favourite books and authors when you were a teenager, and what about now?
Well, when I was a teenager, I used to read a lot of Stephen King books. I used to go through his books with an amazing appetite for his writing. And there was one particular Stephen King book that really, really lodged in my mind and stayed there. And it was a book called Carrie. It's a fantastic story. It's a story about a girl in high school who has these telepathic powers, but she keeps them hidden because, we all want to fit in. We want to be the same as everyone else. So she keeps these powers hidden. But she's bullied, she's picked on by the other girls in her school. All the way through her high school years, she's picked on. And finally, in the last year of high school, as we approach the high school prom, she's the victim of a prank, a very, very cruel prank. Those girls who've been picking on her, bullying her, have finally set up the worst prank of all. They've rigged the election of most beautiful girl at the prom to make sure that she wins. And as she goes up on stage to collect her cup, finally thinking that she's been accepted by all the other girls in the school, finally accepted to be their friend, the prank is played. Above her, in the rafters above the stage, is a bucket full of pig's blood. And as she accepts this award and finally thinks she's been accepted by her peers, somebody pulls a rope on that bucket and it comes tumbling down and drenches her in this horrible, glutinous mixture of blood and offal. And she finally snaps. And her mental powers, her telepathic powers, I believe the term is, are unleashed upon every child in that gymnasium. And it's the most horrific scene I've ever read in my life. And it stays with me. I still actually wake up having nightmares about that scene. Carrie by Stephen King. Just check it out.
And what about now? What are you reading at the moment?
And what am I reading now? What am I reading now? I do a lot of research reading now because a lot of that goes into Time Riders. But when I'm not doing research reading, I will be honest with you, I'm rereading, because my son was looking at them, I'm rereading the Tintin books, which are fantastic. They're great. I mean, look, I'm 46. I should be reading proper books, but for the moment, for the next few weeks, I'm just going to be indulging myself with Tintin.
Lovely. Okay. When did you know you wanted to be a writer, and what inspired you?
When I was 9, I was writing lots and lots of short stories. I think they were probably all horrendously bad, really bad. In fact, I was looking through an old exercise book of mine, and I found myself cringing at the pidgin English I was using. But at 9, I had this bug for writing stories. Because I remember thinking back then when I was 9, when you create a story, you create a world. And what are you if you create a world? Well, you are God of that world. That's a very powerful tool. When you're a story writer, you become a god of your own world, and you can decide how the rules work, how the physics works, how the characters behave. It's incredibly empowering. And then something happened to me. I just got into rock music and playing guitar, and I was in a bunch of bands until my late 20s. I was in, no less than 7 unsuccessful bands. And then in my late 20s, I had to stop living the dream. I had to get a job, and then I had a job for 10 years. And then finally, in my 30s, I think the bug finally came back to me, and I started writing again.
Are any characters in the books based on yourself or people you know?
Who are the characters based on in TimeRiders? Well, do you know, I was asked this the other day at a school, and I finally realised I know what the answer is to this question. And I've been fluffing it for a while, but I now realise that the key characters, Maddie, Liam, Sal, Bob even, I realise now are all aspects of me. They're parts of my personality. They're not based on other people. I think I've been pulling out parts of my psyche. Liam is the part of me that just hasn't grown up yet. He's still a kid. Maddie is the part of me that has had to grow up. I'm a father. I've got to be responsible, and I see that in Maddie. She's the team leader. She's got to keep it together even when everyone else is flapping around. Sal, well, I think there's a part of me that's very, very introvert and quiet and just likes to look and study and not say much. And Bob, well, do you know what? I can be just as gormless and clumsy as Bob sometimes. I think he's the clumsy dad side of me.
If the series was made into a movie or TV show, are there any particular actors you'd love to see in the lead roles?
Who would I cast in TimeRiders? Well, that's a really tricky one because, you know, if you start thinking about casting for a film now, your film might not be made for 10, 15 years. This is how Hollywood works. So it's really difficult to think who you'd cast because by the time you get around to making the film, they're too old. But one particular character I've had in mind since I started writing TimeRiders, and he just doesn't seem to age, and he has that vulnerability, that nerdiness, but that sense of adventure that I think characterizes Liam so well. And that's the actor Tobey Maguire. You would know him, of course, as Spider-Man or Peter Parker. But he has that, when he's not Spider-Man, he's a bit of a dork. And I think, yeah, Liam has that certain dorkiness that I just love. As for the others, though, that's really tough. What do you think? Who would you cast for Maddie, for Sal, for Bob?
Have any of your characters surprised you as the series unfolds?
Do the characters surprise me? Well, in broad terms, no, because I have all 9 books mapped out. You've got to. You're dealing with time travel, you can't wing it. You've got to know how the whole thing plays out. So in broad brushstrokes, I know the storyline, but that doesn't mean from chapter to chapter, the characters can't really begin to speak for themselves. And you know, that's what I'm finding. When I sit down to write, and I know what a chapter has to do in the story, but quite often I do feel like I'm just turning up to take dictation as these characters start yapping to each other. They've got minds of their own. And that's a weird thing, actually, to have 3 or 4 characters in my head all the time with their own opinions, their own ways they'd like to say their lines. So they do constantly surprise me.
Do any questions you've been asked at schools and appearances stand out for you, either because they're brilliant or inane?
The coolest question I think I've ever been asked is a very simple one. It went something along the lines of, Mr. Scarrow, yes, forwards or backwards? And what he was asking was, would you like to travel forward in time or backwards in time? And that actually stumped me for a while because I've never really thought about it in depth. But then having had some time to think about, yes, I would like to go backwards. And to a specific time, actually, a very, very specific time. I think to 39,000 years ago. Because back then, 39,000 years ago, the Mediterranean was a dry, arid basin, a huge, dry river valley. And you may have heard of a place called the Rock of Gibraltar. That was the beginnings of a rock peninsula that went across and links to North Africa, a big, long spine of rock that was holding back the Atlantic Ocean. Well, 39,000 years ago, geologists believe that was when that wall collapsed. And they calculated that it took about 50 years for the Atlantic to fill up the Mediterranean. Well, I want to be there on the day that wall cracks and just watch that whole thing go off. That would be fantastic.
Do you mind if if I just ask you an extra one?
Yeah, sure.
What do you like to do on your days off when you're not writing?
What do I do my days off when I'm not writing? There's no such thing as a day off for a writer. You are constantly. I always have with me a little black book. It's a really dog-eared black book, but I've had it with me for 15 years now. It's where I write silly little weirdly phrased sentences, just curious ideas, notions, maybe a character with a strange trait or a situation. And that's always with me, which means even if I'm on holiday somewhere, even when I'm off snowboarding, I've always got that thing in my backpack. And when I'm stopping for a break, I've even sat down and sketched out ideas for books on the side of a slope, taking a break from boarding down. So you're never really off duty. But if I truly am off duty, well, it's probably because I'm asleep.